The US-Venezuela conflict is a story already being written in front of our eyes, and the burning question the people of the two countries cannot ignore is simple. Could all of this really end in war in some years? Maybe by 2030? To answer that, we need to look at not just the headlines of today, but also the long line of history, the patterns of power, and the real reasons behind every move being made on both sides. And once you do that, the idea of a war between the United States and Venezuela stops sounding like wild speculation and starts looking like a dangerous possibility. On September 2nd, 2025, an American military strike hit a Venezuelan-operated vessel in the southern Caribbean, killing 11 people. America's explanation was that the boat was linked to Tren de Aragua, one of Latin America's most feared gangs, accused of drug trafficking and violence across the region. But Venezuela called it murder and accused the U.S. of hiding behind the drug war to justify aggression.
Venezuela has now claimed that the United States seized a fishing boat.
But the real truth of what happened that day remains cloudy. Were those really smugglers? Or were they civilians caught in the crossfire? Then came another incident. The U.S. destroyer ship Jason Dunham reportedly boarded a Venezuelan tuna boat with 9 fishermen on board. The boarding lasted hours in waters that Venezuela claims as its own. And just days ago, there was yet another strike, leaving 3 more people dead. One strike might have been called an accident. 2 might have been written off as a mistake. But 3 strikes in just over 2 weeks? That looks like the start of a campaign. And campaigns have trajectories. Once they start, they rarely stop easily. The Americans say they are chasing drug traffickers, but the weapons being used, the destroyers, the F-35 jets, the Marines stationed in Puerto Rico do not look like tools for fighting gangs. They look like the tools of power, projection, of intimidation, of a message sent not only to Venezuela but to the rest of Latin America and even to rivals like China and Russia. That is why this conflict is not really about drugs. It's about control. To decode where this might go by 2030, we need to remember the history between the US and Venezuela. For decades, Washington tolerated Venezuelan governments because the oil flowed smoothly north. But when Hugo Chávez came to power in 1999, promising socialism, nationalization, and resistance against Yankee imperialism, the relationship began to rot. Chávez courted Moscow, welcomed Chinese investment, and used oil money to buy influence across the region. When Nicolás Maduro took over after Chávez's death, the economic collapse that followed was historic. Hyperinflation, shortages, millions of Venezuelans fleeing across borders. For Washington, Maduro was not just another authoritarian, it was a man propped up by enemies of the U.S., running a broken state sitting on the world's largest oil reserves. Sanctions, diplomatic pressure, even recognition of opposition leader Juan Guaidó as interim president, none of it toppled Maduro. Instead, it made him more defiant. He portrayed every move as proof that the U.S. wanted regime change, and that message helped him keep hold of power despite the suffering of his people. By 2025, Maduro had one clear card left: nationalism. And nationalism thrives when there is a foreign enemy to resist. The U.S. strikes gave him that enemy. So how does this lead to 2030? Because when nationalism hardens on one side and strategic pressure mounts on the other, the space for compromise shrinks. Right now, the U.S. is escalating its military presence in the Caribbean. More ships, more planes, more troops. Officially, it is a counter-narcotics mission. Unofficially, it is a reminder. In 1989, the U.S. invaded Panama to oust Manuel Noriega, who, like Maduro, was accused of drug trafficking. It lasted just weeks, but it showed that Washington had no hesitation using force in its own hemisphere. In 1983, the U.S. invaded Grenada, again under the justification of protecting its interests. In Iraq in 2003, the justification shifted to weapons of mass destruction, but the pattern was the same. Paint the target as a threat, prepare public opinion, and then unleash overwhelming force. When critics today ask whether Venezuela could be the next Panama, the next Iraq, they are not being dramatic. They are pointing to a playbook America has used before. The Venezuelan side of the story is equally revealing. This is not a strong state facing a weak adversary. It is a weak state being cornered by the strongest military power in the world. When cornered, weak states often lash out, not because they can win, but because they cannot afford to look like they surrendered. Venezuela's military is not a match for the U.S. Navy or Air Force. But it has Coast Guard vessels, anti-ship missiles, and militias who know the terrain. A single miscalculation, an American ship too close to shore, a Venezuelan missile battery firing in panic could spark a confrontation that spirals. And the stakes are not just national pride. Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves. Control of Venezuelan oil has always been a strategic prize. In the era of energy transition, when fossil fuels are slowly being replaced, this oil may be one of the last great reserves that truly matter. Add to this Venezuela's closeness with Russia and China. Beijing has already loaned billions to Caracas, often in exchange for oil. Moscow has sent advisors and weapons. If Venezuela becomes a stage for U.S. confrontation, it is not hard to see how great power rivalry could leak into this crisis. That is when a regional conflict begins to look like part of a global chessboard. By 2030, the possibilities split into two clear paths. In one, the strikes continue, the Venezuelans retaliate, and eventually, an incident spirals into war. In the other, the tension holds loud, dangerous, costly, but both sides stop short of crossing the line. Which is more likely depends on choices being made today. But what is certain is that every new strike, every new troop deployment, every new speech calling the other side an aggressor pushes the scale closer to the side of war. What makes this conflict even riskier is the lack of clarity. The U.S. insists it is targeting gangs like Tren de Aragua, but it refuses to disclose evidence. Who exactly was on the boats that were destroyed? Were they traffickers, or were some of them ordinary Venezuelans? Why use billion-dollar jets and destroyers for small boats? Why board fishing vessels in contested waters? These unanswered questions create suspicion, and suspicion is fuel for confrontation. If the strikes were purely about narcotics, the U.S. could have worked with regional governments, shared intelligence, or pursued international cooperation. The choice to go it alone with military hardware says something deeper. This is about dominance, not just drugs. For ordinary Venezuelans, the fear is that their country becomes another Iraq, another place where America decides the regime is unacceptable and uses force to settle the matter. For ordinary Americans, the fear is that a conflict supposedly about narcotics could trap them in another endless foreign entanglement. For the rest of the world, the fear is that oil markets, migration flows, and great power rivalries will all be destabilized if the U.S.-Venezuela conflict tips into open war. The U.S.-Venezuela conflict tips into open war. As of mid-September 2025, both governments seem locked into their narratives. Washington talks about narco-terrorists. Caracas talks about sovereignty. Neither side is showing signs of stepping back, and that is the most important clue about where we might be by 2030. Wars are not born in a single moment. They are born in slow escalations, in cycles of provocation and retaliation, in leaders who cannot back down without looking weak. That cycle is already underway. The future of the U.S.-Venezuela conflict is not just about whether the strikes continue, or whether Maduro survives, or whether drug gangs thrive. It is about whether two countries, trapped in their own logic of power and pride, allow a small spark to become a fire that consumes them both. Could there be a war in 2030? Yes. Could it be avoided? Also, yes. The difference will come from the decisions taken now, in these tense days of 2025, when the foundations of that future are being laid. Every time a U.S. jet takes off from Puerto Rico, every time a Venezuelan unit mobilizes
the Trump
along the
administration
coast,
says
every time a
Venezuelan
fishing boat is
President
boarded,
Nicolás Maduro
the clock
is
ticks
behind the
closer.
drug smuggling into the
Maybe
U.S.
we will look back from
Although Venezuela
2030
exports just a
and say the
fraction of
warnings
what
were
comes from
alarmist.
neighboring countries like
Or maybe
Colombia.
we will look
Trump
back and
has
say the
offered a
signs were all
$50
there,
million
and nobody
reward
wanted
for
to see
Maduro's
them.
arrest.
The truth is
drug
that
charges.
the future of the U.S.-Venezuela conflict
point
is
of
being
doing
built
this?
brick by
Blowing
brick,
up individual
strike by
speedboats
strike,
heading for the
speech by
Dragon's
speech.
mouths isn't going to
And
solve
unless
America's
something
drug
changes,
problem.
that future
But
may look
when you look at this
a
from
lot
a
like war.
historical perspective,